Hello students, my name is Niyati Saeed and thanks for watching Edupedia word videos. My topic for the presentation is the fourth section of breathing and exchange of gases. That is disorders of respiratory system. Okay. Students, you must be astonished to know that the respiratory system that lies dormant in the human fetus during pregnancy. At birth, the respiratory system becomes fully functional upon exposure to air. Although some lung development and growth, it continues throughout the childhood. Preterm birth can lead to infants with underdeveloped lungs. But as soon as they are between us, the smoking, air pollution, they are the two major causes of respiratory problems. Now we'll discuss about the disorders of the respiratory system that can be classified into four major areas. First is obstructive condition, for example emphysema, bronchitis, asthma attacks, etc. Second comes restrictive conditions, for example fibrosis, cystic fibrosis, alveolar damage, pleural effusion, and sarcoidosis. And the third comes is vascular disease, for example pulmonary edema. Edema means swelling, pulmonary embolism, pulmonary hypertension. So these are the three main categories of the disorders of the respiratory system. And the fourth comes is infectious environmental and other diseases. For example, pneumonia, tuberculosis, asbestosis, particulate pollutants, etc. Coughing is of major importance as it is the body's main method to remove dust, mucus, saliva and other debris from the lungs. And inability to cough can lead to infection. Deep breathing exercises may help keep you the structures of the lungs clear from the particulate matter. As we know that the respiratory tract is constantly exposed to microbes due to extensive surface area, which is why the respiratory system includes many mechanisms to defend itself and prevent pathogens from entering the body. Now let's study about the asthma. Asthma means it's a periodic constriction of the bronchi and the bronchioles, making it more difficult to breathe. So it is a difficulty in the breathing that causes wheezing due to inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. For that purpose, patients have to take asthma inhalers. This is the asthma attack airway. This third image, as you can see how it gets constricted and it causes difficulty in breathing, and that causes wheezing due to inflammation of bronchi and the bronchioles. This is the normal airway, in which bronchi and the bronchioles are of normal structure, which is made up of relaxed smooth muscles. This is the asthmatic airway, in which you can see the passage for the air constricted. And this is the asthmatic airway during attacks. Now you can see how it has constricted and it has become more tightened. The smooth muscles have become more tightened, and here the air is trapped in the alveoli, so it becomes very difficult in breathing for the asthmatic patient. That causes wheezing due to inflammation of bronchi and the bronchioles. Now comes emphysema. Emphysema, in this, the delicate walls of the alveoli, they break down, and that reduces the gas exchange rate of the lungs. The condition develops more slowly and is seldom a direct cause of death. As you can see, this is the normal alveoli, and this is the bronchitis alveoli, and this is emphysema bronchi, bronchioles. or you can say alveoli. Okay, in this, the alveolar wall are damaged, due to which respiratory surface is decreased. Okay, and the major cause of emphysema is cigarette smoking. Okay, so we can say the delicate walls of the alveoli, they break down, and thus it reduces the gas exchange area of the lungs, because the gaseous exchange area is alveoli, and that it reduces the alveoli, or you can say the gas exchange area of the lungs, and the condition develops slowly and is seldom a direct cause of death. And the major cause of emphysema is cigarette smoking. Okay, now how does it gets affected by smoking? Inhaled smoke, as we know, that it contains CO2, which affects the CO2 diffusion gradient. Okay, carcinogenic chemicals that can trigger tumors. Carcinogenic chemical means the one which can cause cancer. Okay, so that can trigger the cancer cells. Toxic nicotine, which paralyzes cilia that normally clean the lungs, as we know that there are cilia are also present in the lungs. So the nicotine which is contained in the, you can say, cigarette, that paralyzes the cilia that normally cleans our lungs. Okay, so that is the way that it affects our alveoli, or you can say the delicate walls of alveoli. Okay, now beside cancer, smoking can also lead to emphysema. Alveoli become dry and brittle. Okay, and eventually it ruptures off. Both active and the passive smoking. Passive smoking, suppose one is smoking and you are sitting in front of that person, so you become passive smoker. Okay, because you are inhaling its smoke, so you are a kind of second hand smoker. Okay, and both active and the passive smoking can lead to lung problems. Okay, so this is the non-cancer image and this is the smoker images. Not just tobacco, it can cause cancer and emphysema, lung cancer and the emphysema. Okay, now comes the bronchitis. Bronchitis is an inflammation of the bronchi that is caused by irritants, okay, such as cigarette smoke, air pollution, or infections. The inflammation results in swelling of the mucous membrane that lines the bronchi. Means bronchi, it is always lined by a mucous membrane. So the inflammation, it results in the edema of the mucous membrane lining of the bronchi. Okay, increased mucus production and decreased movement of mucus by cilia. Consequently, that means as a result, the diameter of the bronchi is decreased and the ventilation is impaired. Okay, and the bronchitis can progress to emphysema. Okay, so you can say that emphysema is the later stage of bronchitis. First, the patient becomes a sufferer of bronchitis, and then it leads to emphysema later on. Okay, now comes respiratory syncytial virus. Okay, respiratory syncytial virus, that is RSV, is a common respiratory virus that can affect people of all ages. It is not age bound. Okay, most people, including infants, it is usually develop only mild diseases similar to that of common cold with congestion, okay, and running nose, cough, but for some it can be severe and can become life threatening. Okay, now comes the cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is one of the most common inherited disorders in the Caucasian population in the US. Okay, cystic fibrosis is caused by a mutation of a single gene, and that gene is known as CFTR gene, which controls salt balance in the lung. Okay, so the CFTR gene, it controls the salt balance in our lungs. Okay, and it is responsible by the CFTR gene, which is located in the chromosome number 7. Okay, now the CFTR protein, it regulates the amount of chloride ions across the cell membrane of lung cells. Okay, As you can see, these are the channels, okay, and chloride ion, it moves inside this spore, or you can say channel, and it is a cell membrane, okay, double layer cell membrane, and these limb-like structures are nucleoside binding domain, regulatory domain, and site of common phenylalanine deletion. Okay, we are not going into deep, okay, but just know that a normal CFTR protein, it regulates the amount of the chloride ion across the cell membrane of lung cells. If the interior of the cell is too salty, suppose this area is too salty, or you can say that the interior of the cell is too salty, water is drawn from lung mucus by osmosis, and thus it causes the mucus to become very thick and sticky. Okay, very thick and sticky. So ultimately what happens? Now, at this point, there is no cure for cystic fibrosis, though there are therapies that have extended the lives of cystic fibrosis patients, including lung transplants. Okay, but there is one therapy which is known as gene therapy. As we know that CFTR gene is responsible for the cystic fibrosis, so the gene therapy may one day insert good CFTR genes into lung cells to make them operate normally. Okay, as you can see that this is the nucleus of the cell, and these are the nasal cells. Okay, this is the nasal cell, and this is the normal gene. Okay, and organs which are affected by the cystic fibrosis is sinus. Okay, lungs, your lungs get affected by the cystic fibrosis. So, it becomes thick, sticky, mucus gets built up in the lungs, and it makes very tough. Okay, bacterial infection and widened airways. Your liver also gets affected by the cystic fibrosis. In this, it blocks the biliary ducts. Okay, the one which secretes bile. Okay, and then pancreas, intestine, and reproductive organs also gets affected by the cystic fibrosis. Okay, and this is the normal airway, where you can see the airway wall. You can also see the airway lined with a thin layer of the mucus. Okay, these are the mucus, and this is the airway with the cystic fibrosis that becomes very thick. Mucus also gets built up, it becomes thick, and it widens airway. And mucus, along with the mucus, blood is also there, so it becomes very tough kind of. Okay, now comes occupational respiratory disorders. Occupational respiratory disorders is suppose in certain industries, especially those involving grinding or stone breaking, so much dust is produced that the defense mechanism of the body cannot fully cope with the situation. Long exposure can give rise to inflammation, and thus it leads to fibrosis. Fibrosis is the proliferation of the fibrous tissues, and thus it causes serious lung damage. Workers in such industry should wear protective mask. Okay, so due to exposure of fumes or dust, it is of two types: silicosis and asbestosis. Silicosis is due to breathing of silica, and asbestosis is due to breathing in asbestos particles. Okay, now we'll study silicosis and then asbestosis. Silicosis is a lung disease. Of course, it is a lung disease because we are studying the disorders of the respiratory system. So it is a lung disease which is caused by breathing in tiny bits of silica. Okay, a mineral that is a part of sand, rock, and mineral ores such as quartz. And it mostly affects the worker which are exposed to the silica dust in occupations such as mining, glass manufacturing, and foundry work. Okay, and with passage of time, exposure to silica particle causes scarring in the lungs, which can harm your ability to breathe. Okay, and thus comes asbestosis. It is also a lung disease that develops from the presence of asbestos fibers, which can lead to scarring, and it restricts your breathing and interferes with the ability of oxygen to enter the bloodstream. Okay, this is the normal X-ray, and this is the asbestosis X-ray. In this, you can see the presence of the asbestos fibers in the red dots, okay, which can lead to scarring, and it restricts your breathing, and finally it interferes with the ability of oxygen to enter the bloodstream. Okay, as you can very well see here that these are the alveoli, or you can say grape-like structures, which has asbestos fibers in it, and asbestos fiber, it limits the exchange of oxygen into the bloodstream, and finally it causes obstruction in breathing and interferes with the ability of oxygen to enter the bloodstream. Okay, now comes pneumonia. Pneumonia is an infection of the alveoli. It can be caused by many kinds of both bacteria, for example Streptococcus pneumoniae, and viruses. Tissue fluids, they accumulate in the alveoli, and thus it is very well known that when tissue it accumulates in the alveoli, that it reduces surface area exposed to the air. Okay, if enough alveoli are affected, the patient may need supplemental oxygen. Okay, now comes the sleep apnea. What is sleep apnea? It is also known as OSA. What is OSA? OSA is obstructive sleep apnea. It is a disease that interrupts sleep by stopping and starting your breathing. Those patients with OSA, that is obstructive sleep apnea, have airways that repeatedly collapse. It keeps on collapsing. Okay, when throat muscles relax during sleep, and thus it blocks the flow of air. And this disease can cause you to snore, and it also chokes the entire airway. Okay, and thus it can gasp during sleep. Okay, that's why it is known as obstructive sleep apnea. Okay, now comes ARDS. ARDS is acute respiratory distress syndrome. Okay, acute respiratory distress syndrome is a rapidly progressive disease that occurs in critically ill patients. Okay, the main complication in ARDS is that fluid leaks into the lung, and thus it makes breathing difficult or impossible. Okay, this is the diagram. As you can see that main complication in ARDS is that fluid, it leaks into the lungs, or you can say that alveoli becomes occupied with the fluid. Okay, and thus it becomes very difficult to breathe, because as we know that alveoli are the main site for the gaseous exchange, and when the fluid is filled in the alveoli, then it becomes very difficult for breathing. Okay, so it is a rapidly progressive disease that occurs in critically ill patients. Now comes the pertussis. Pertussis is a whooping cough. At the end of the coughing spell, the child gasps for air with the characteristic whooping sound. Okay, as you can see in this diagram, and infants may not whoop at all or as loudly as older children. Okay, now in this, severe coughing spells can lead to vomiting and may make it hard for child to eat or drink, and it can continue for several weeks. Now comes the diphtheria. Diphtheria is an acute bacterial disease that usually affects the tonsils, throat, nose, and skin. Okay, it is most common where people live in crowded conditions. Unimmunized child, the one which is not immunized, is known as unimmunized children under 15 years of age are likely to contract diphtheria. They are likely to contract diphtheria because the disease is often found among adults whose immunization was neglected and is most severe in unimmunized or inadequately immunized individuals. And then comes pharyngitis. Pharyngitis means the inflammation of tonsil, pharynx, and the larynx. As you can see, this is the red part which shows the inflammation. So in most cases it is painful, and initial infection can extend for a lengthy time period and is often referred to as a sore throat. Okay, An acute pharyngitis can result in very large tonsils, which causes trouble in swallowing and breathing. Okay. Some cases are also accompanied by cough or fever, and it is also seen in the acute cases that it is caused by viral infections, with the remainder caused by bacterial infection, fungal infection, or irritants such as pollutants or chemical substances. Okay. Now comes the chronic bronchitis. What is chronic bronchitis? Any irritant that causes irritation or inflammation, it reaches the bronchi and the bronchiole will stimulate an increased secretion of mucus. In chronic bronchitis, the air passage becomes clogged with mucus, and this leads to a persistent cough. Okay, and it is usually associated with the cigarette smoking. It is very well seen. And then comes pulmonary fibrosis. We have already studied cystic fibrosis, and this is pulmonary fibrosis. Pulmonary means lung tissue. Okay, and pulmonary fibrosis is the replacement of the lung tissue with the fibrous connective tissue, and thus it makes the lungs less elastic and breathing more difficult or more obstructive. Okay. And exposure to asbestos, silica, coal dust is the most common cause of the pulmonary fibrosis. Now comes idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Please note that pulmonary fibrosis and idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, they both are the same, but it is more advanced than pulmonary fibrosis. Okay, so it is more advanced lung disease, you can say. So it is a type of a lung disease that results in a scarring of the lungs for an unknown reason, and over time the scarring gets worse and becomes hard to take in a deep breath, and the lungs cannot take enough oxygen. Okay, it is a form of interstitious lung disease that is primarily involves the interstitium. Interstitium is a tissue and the space around the air sacs of the lung. Okay, or you can say the alveoli. Okay, and not directly affects the airways or the blood vessels. Now comes the sarcoidosis, is a disease that causes your immune system to overreact, which can lead to health issues. Okay, it can cause lung damage, skin rashes, and eye diseases, and can also affect other organs of the body. So this was all about the disorders of the respiratory system. Thank you, and stay tuned and keep watching Edupedia Word videos.